The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a fight that occurred during the Tunisia campaign of World War II in February 1943. It was a progression of fights battled around the Kasserine Pass. The Axis powers led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were mostly from the Afrika Korps Assault Group, components of the Italian Centauro Armored Division, 2 panzer divisions detached from the 5th Panzer Army. The Allied forces included the U.S. Army 2nd Corps led by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, and the British 6th Armored Division led by Major General Charles Keightley, which were part of the British 1st Army instructed by Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson. Significant as the first large-scale gathering of American and German forces in World War II, the generally untested and poorly led American troops suffered overwhelming losses and were pushed back 50 miles from their positions west of the Fight Pass in the initial days of the fight. In spite of early defeats, components of the U.S. 2nd Corps, strengthened by British reserves, rallied and held the passageways through the mountain passes in western Tunisia, defeating the Axis offensive plans. After the battle, the U.S. Army founded major changes from unit-level organization to the replacing of commanders. When the same rivals next met, sometimes just weeks later, the U.S. forces were extensively more effective. In Operation Torch, there were 3 major battles: the Battle of Casablanca, the Battle in Oran, and the Battle of Algiers. The Western Task Force aimed at Casablanca was led by Major General George S. Patton, with Rear Admiral Henry K. Hewitt heading the naval operations. The Western Task Force consisted of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division and the U.S. 3rd and 9th Infantry Divisions, 35,000 troops and 100 ships. The Central Task Force aimed at Iran was led by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, with Commander Thomas Trubridge commanding naval forces. The force consisted of the U.S. 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment and the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and the U.S. 1st Armored Division, a total of 18,500 troops. The Eastern Task Force aimed at Algiers was led by Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, with naval forces commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Harold Burrow. During the landing phase, the troops were led by U.S. Major General Charles WWII. It consisted of 2 brigades from the British 78th and the U.S. 34th Infantry Divisions, along with 2 British commander units, a total of 20,000 troops.
(1942). With the German military machine advancing across the globe unchecked, the Allies decide on a confrontation in French North Africa, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reigns supreme. Under the terms of its armistice with Germany, the Vichy French in Africa must fight off any such invasions or face retribution in France. The Allied objective is to block Axis occupation of these French territories and set up Allied bases for operations against Italy and Germany from the south. Called Operation Torch, it's the first major amphibious landing of World War II. In London, Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower supervises the complex arrangement of air, sea, and land forces. The landings are set for November 8th. Eisenhower decides to restrict the landings to Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. A shortage of landing craft and aircraft carriers precludes a more extensive plan.
Many of the U.S. infantrymen which were in Operation Torch had been training since 1940. There were then large-scale amphibious exercises held on both the Pacific and Atlantic coast of the United States. This was all being improvised. No one really knew how to make a large-scale amphibious invasion, and especially one of the size of Operation Torch, where many of the troops would come not from a base in Europe, but direct from the United States.
The reason for Hitler's success in North Africa is the Panzer Corps, which had been formed 2 years earlier. At that time, Heinz Oberger is a non-commissioned officer in the Panzer Army.
Die Italiener hatten im September 1900
In September 1940, the Italians crossed the Egyptian border and they advanced about 80 kilometers into West Egypt. In December, the British went on the defensive under General Wavell. In a relatively short time, they broke through and threatened Tripoli. Hitler said we need to prevent an Axis member from an impending defeat, and he ordered the founding of the German Afrika Corps. Later, we became an elite group. At the beginning, it was just normal soldiers who joined. We began the transfer to Naples and Brindisi, and from there we were shipped to Tripoli. We dreamed of palm trees and savannas, and we were deeply disappointed when we arrived in a landscape that consisted only of sand. Palms were a rarity and water was short. When there was water, it was salty. We had little opportunity to get rid of our disappointment because Rommel, who was named leader of the Afrika Corps, immediately ordered the march to the east to prevent further advance of the British. After Rommel led a few surprise attacks, British General Wavell said, "He is sly as a fox and we have to watch out for him." And since that time he had the name the Desert Fox.
After controlling North Africa for 2 years, Rommel's crushing Panzer unit is in for a series of major losses. At the end of October, an armada of 350 warships and 500 transports secretly heads out to sea from various ports in the United States and Great Britain. Their rendezvous, a point 4,000 miles away off the North Africa coast.
Once at sea, the men were told their destination was French North Africa, and that they were hoping to land as liberators to the French and not as adversaries. Much of the education, there was talk on board ships about being good to the local people, much of which being very political correct, even tended to show the population of North Africa as being composed basically of saints and noble people. Some of this was indeed aimed at creating good results to the troops and preventing hostility from the local people.
In transit, the troops hear an important announcement on the loudspeaker system. They're told that British General Bernard Montgomery and his 8th Army have succeeded in breaking through the German lines at El Alamein. It's a huge victory for the Allies and a disastrous defeat for Rommel and his proud Afrika Corps. November 8, 1942, the American fleet sets off the coast of Africa. But the big question in everyone's mind is how much resistance will the French collaborationist army give them?
In Morocco, the U.S. encountered its strongest opposition. The French Navy, the battleship Jean Bart, engaged the U.S. Navy battleship Massachusetts. U.S. Navy dive bombers had to be used against French naval attacks. On the ground, French-Moroccan troops put up for several days very strong resistance against U.S. forces on the ground until an armistice could be agreed to. The U.S. troops which went into Operation Torch were all green. They had never seen action before, while the French which opposed them were relatively poorly equipped, not set up for modern warfare. In many places, they encountered very strong resistance from the French.
The first Battle of El Alamein was in July 1st and July 27 in 1942. It occurred on Western Desert Campaign in the Second World War, fought in the northern part of coastal Egypt. The war was between the Axis, Germany and Italy. The Allies was Britain, British India, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. The Allies won the battle with only 13,250 casualties. The Axis lost 17,000 casualties. The Allies went into war with 150,000 troops, 179 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces, and 1,500 planes. The Axis went with 96,000 troops, 70 tanks, 500 planes, and the war took 27 days for the Allies to win. The battle had occurred close to a big population city. The Second Battle of El Alamein was on October 23rd and November 11th in 1942. The Allies won the second battle, also driving Germany out of Egypt. The Allies in the second battle consisted of the United Kingdom, India, Australia, New Zealand, Union of South Africa, Free French Forces, and Kingdom of Greece. The Allies went with 195,000 men, 1,029 tanks, 435 armored cars, 750 aircraft, 908 artillery pieces, 1,451 anti-tank guns. The Allies only had 13,560 casualties. The Axis consisted of Germany and Italy. They went in war with 116,000 men, 457 tanks, 192 armored cars, 900 aircraft, 552 artillery pieces, 496 anti-tank guns. The Axis had a total of 30,542 casualties. War in Egypt was difficult due to the heat and desert, so warfare made it hard to fight on both wars of El Alamein.
After the Axis defeat in El Alamein, Erwin Rommel ordered a retreat into eastern Libya. Heerschap Africa was reformed with Rommel in command. It also included Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army and Giovanni Messe's Italian 1st Army. For the Allies, Major General Douglas Wimberley commanded the 51st Division. General George Erskine commanded the 7th Armored Division, and Bernard Freyberg commanded the New Zealand 2nd Division. It was an Allied victory, with only 130 casualties, while the Axis powers had 700 casualties and lost 52 tanks. After the defeat of the Italian forces at Keren, many of the remaining Italians withdrew to 3 strongholds: Amba, Alagi, Jima, and Gondar. Amba Alagi fell in May and Jima fell in July. There were 2 mountain passes that overlooked the town, which were controlled by the Italian troops. They were invested by the 2 brigades of the 12th African Division. The 2 Italian groups in the passes were cut off and were forced to surrender when their supplies ran out. Once the Allied troops had taken the passes, they gained control of the heights overlooking the town. They attacked on the 27th of November.